Margaret Hale wasn't brought to Wyoming as a bride. She was delivered like evidence to be buried. When the wagon rolled away from Ethan Cole's isolated ranch, leaving behind a woman with hollow eyes and a single worn bag, he knew something was wrong. The papers called it a land settlement. Her family called it charity. But the way she stood in the dust, silent and still as stone, told a different story. This wasn't rescue. This was exile. And somewhere in the silence between them lay a secret dark enough to hang her, if the truth ever came to light. If you're watching from somewhere in this world, drop your city in the comments below. Let's see how far Margaret's story travels. And if you want to know whether she survives what's coming, stay until the end and hit that like button. The August sun sat heavy over the Wyoming territory, turning the air thick and still. Ethan Cole stood on his porch, one hand shading his eyes, watching the dust cloud grow larger along the eastern road. He'd been expecting the wagon for 3 days. Legal business, the letter had said. Settlement of terms. Nothing more. He pulled the paper from his shirt pocket and read it again, though he'd memorized every word by now. In consideration of debts owed and lands transferred, the party of the second part agrees to receive Margaret Hale, widow, age 28, in full satisfaction of outstanding obligations between the estates of Jonathan Hale, deceased, and Ethan Cole, landowner. Receive, not marry, not employ. Receive, like she was a shipment of lumber. Ethan folded the letter and tucked it away, jaw tight. He hadn't asked for this. Hadn't known the land deal he'd made 6 months ago with a Missouri lawyer carried a human being as part of the transaction. The whole thing felt wrong. Had felt wrong since the day the second letter arrived, informing him of the arrangement. But the land was good. 200 acres of prime grazing territory, water rights included. He'd paid fair price. If this was how the Hale family chose to clear their obligations, that was their business. The wagon drew closer. 2 horses, a driver in a dark coat, and a single passenger in the back. Ethan couldn't make out details yet, but he could see the way she sat, upright, motionless, hands folded in her lap, not looking around, not curious, just waiting. He descended the porch steps, boots crunching on the dry earth. The land around him stretched in every direction, his land now, bought with years of hard work and careful saving. The house was modest but solid, the barn well maintained, the fences straight. He ran cattle, kept to himself, and answered to no one. It was the life he'd chosen after the war, after watching too many men die over things that didn't matter. Out here, things were simple. Work, eat, sleep, survive. Until now. The wagon pulled up in front of the house, and the driver, a thin man with spectacles and the pinched look of someone who'd traveled too far in the heat, climbed down stiffly. "Mr. Cole?" "That's right." The man pulled papers from inside his coat. "Samuel Porter, attorney for the Hale estate. I trust you received our correspondence regarding the, settlement terms?" Ethan's eyes moved past him to the woman in the wagon. She was looking at the house now, her face partially shadowed by a plain bonnet. What he could see of her expression revealed nothing. No hope, no fear, no anger. Just a careful blankness that made something twist in his chest. "I got your letters," Ethan said. "Excellent. Then you're aware that Mrs. Hale comes as part of the final settlement. All terms have been satisfied on the Missouri end. We simply require your signature here and here." Porter thrust the papers forward, indicating 2 blank lines with ink-stained fingers. Ethan didn't take them. "Where's her signature?" "I beg your pardon?" "Her signature, on the agreement. Seems like she ought to have a say in being received." Porter's smile thinned. "Mrs. Hale is a widow with no independent means, Mr. Cole. Her late husband's family has generously arranged for her care. This is a legal settlement, properly executed. Her consent was obtained in Missouri." Was it? The question hung in the air. For the first time, the woman in the wagon moved, turning her head slightly to look at him. Her eyes were gray, light gray, almost colorless in the bright sun. They met his for just a moment, and in that moment he saw something that made his decision. Not pleading, not gratitude, wariness. The kind that came from experience. Ethan took the papers and scanned them quickly. Standard territorial contract language, transfer of obligations, release of claims. At the bottom, in neat script, Margaret Ann Hale, her mark, Her mark. Not her signature. A mark, like she couldn't write her own name. He looked at her again. She'd turned away, studying the barn with that same careful blankness. This says she can't leave for a year, Ethan said. Standard indenture period to ensure indenture. The word came out hard. You're telling me you brought an indentured woman to my property without asking if I wanted a servant? Porter's face flushed. I'm telling you, Mr. Cole, that this is a legal arrangement. The land deed is contingent upon fulfillment of all terms. If you refuse to honor the settlement, the property reverts to the Hale estate, and you'll forfeit everything you've paid. 200 acres, water rights, 3 years of payments. Ethan looked at the woman again. She was watching them now, her hands still folded in her lap. There was something about the way she held herself, not defeated, but contained. Like she was holding something back with both hands. What happens to her if I don't sign? Ethan asked quietly. Porter blinked. She returns to Missouri. To what? I hardly think that's... To what? The attorney cleared his throat. The Hale family has made arrangements. She'll be cared for. The woman in the wagon made a small sound. Not quite a laugh, not quite a cough. Both men looked at her. She'd turned her face away again, but Ethan saw the tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers tightened against each other. She didn't want to go back. Ethan took the pen Porter offered and signed both lines. The attorney witnessed it, blotted the ink, and tucked the papers away with visible relief. Excellent. Mrs. Hale, you may disembark. She rose slowly, gathering a worn canvas bag from beside her. The driver made no move to help. Porter had already climbed back to his seat. Ethan stepped forward and extended his hand. She looked at it for a long moment before accepting. Her grip was brief but firm, her palm rough with work. When her feet touched the ground, she released him immediately and stepped back. Thank you, she said quietly. Her voice was lower than he'd expected, with a slight rasp that suggested she didn't use it often. Porter was already turning the wagon. Good day, Mr. Cole. The estate wishes you both well. The wagon pulled away, wheels creaking. Dust rose in its wake, settling slowly in the still air. Ethan and Margaret stood in silence as it grew smaller, disappeared into the shimmering heat. When it was gone, she spoke without looking at him. Where should I put my things? There's a room at the back of the house, used to be storage. It's got a bed, a window, not much else. She nodded once and started toward the porch, her bag clutched against her side. Ethan watched her climb the steps, back straight, head up. She moved like someone who'd learned to take up as little space as possible. At the door, she paused. What are the rules? Rules? For the house. Meals, washing, work, what you expect. Ethan rubbed the back of his neck. I didn't ask for this arrangement, Mrs. Hale. I'm not looking for a servant. The paper says I'm indentured for a year. The paper says a lot of things. She turned then, and for the first time he saw her face fully. She wasn't beautiful in any conventional sense. Her features were too strong, her expression too guarded. But there was something arresting about her, a quality he couldn't name. Her skin was weathered, her hair dark and pulled back severely. The dress she wore was threadbare but clean, carefully mended. If I'm not here to work, she said slowly, why am I here? It was a fair question. He didn't have a good answer. I guess we'll figure that out, he said finally. Something flickered across her face. Surprise, maybe? Or suspicion? She studied him for a long moment, those pale gray eyes searching for something he couldn't identify. The room at the back, she said. First door on the right past the kitchen. She went inside. Ethan stood in the yard staring at the empty road, wondering what in the hell he'd just signed. The house felt different with someone else in it. Ethan had lived alone for 5 years, ever since he'd bought the land and built the place himself. He was used to silence, used to the small sounds of solitude, wind through the eaves, mice in the walls, his own footsteps on the wooden floors. Now there were other sounds. The creak of a door opening, water being poured. Quiet footsteps in the back room. He stayed outside until sunset, checking the barn and the fences, anything to give her space to settle. When he finally came in, the kitchen was empty, but he could smell bread. Fresh bread, the yeast and warmth smell filling the whole house. He found it on the table, wrapped in a clean cloth. still warm. Beside it, a note in careful handwriting. Thank you for the room, so she could write. The mark on the contract had been something else then. A choice, or maybe a requirement. Ethan cut a slice of the bread and ate it standing up. It was good, better than good. The kind of bread that took time and attention, not just throwing ingredients together. He heard her door open, and a moment later she appeared in the kitchen doorway. She'd changed into a different dress, just as plain as the first, and taken her hair down. It fell past her shoulders, dark and thick. I used some of your flour, she said. I'll work it off tomorrow. You don't have to. I do. She said it firmly, not arguing, just stating fact. That's how this works. Ethan set down the bread. How what works? This, the arrangement. I'm here because I have nowhere else to go, and you're here because you were forced to take me. The least I can do is make myself useful. Is that what they told you? That you had to make yourself useful? Her jaw tightened. They didn't have to tell me. I'm not a fool, Mr. Cole. Ethan. She blinked. What? My name is Ethan. You don't have to call me Mr. Cole. Yes, I do. He studied her. The defensive set of her shoulders, the way she stood with her back to the wall, keeping the whole room in view. This wasn't just caution. This was survival instinct. What happened in Missouri? He asked quietly. I was widowed. The family settled their debts. That's all that matters. That's not what I asked. Margaret's hands clenched at her sides. With respect, what happened before I came here is none of your concern. I'm here to fulfill the terms of the contract, nothing more. The contract says a year. Yes. And after that? She didn't answer right away. When she did, her voice was carefully neutral. After that, I'll have satisfied my obligations. What happens then is up to me. Ethan nodded slowly. Fair enough. But while you're here, Mrs. Hale, you're not a servant. You're not indentured, no matter what that paper says. You want to bake bread? That's fine. You want to sit in your room and do nothing for a year? That's fine too. But I won't have you treating this like a prison. It's not a prison, she said quietly. Prisons have bars you can see. Before he could respond, she turned and walked back to her room. The door closed softly behind her. Ethan stood in the kitchen for a long time, looking at the bread, thinking about the mark on the contract that wasn't a signature, about the way she'd looked at the road when the wagon disappeared, about the careful blankness in her eyes that couldn't quite hide what was underneath. He didn't know what the Hale family had done to her, but he knew what he'd seen. A woman who'd learned to expect nothing and trust no one. And somehow, for reasons he couldn't explain, that made him angry. Bam. The first week passed in careful silence. Margaret rose before dawn and worked. She cleaned, cooked, mended. She found the abandoned garden plot behind the house and spent hours pulling weeds, turning soil, salvaging what she could of the neglected space. She never asked permission, never asked for help, never spoke unless spoken to. Ethan watched her and said nothing. Every instinct told him to intervene, to tell her she didn't have to work so hard, but he could see it would be pointless. Whatever drove her, it wasn't duty to him. It was something else, something older and deeper. On the 8th day, he came in from checking the cattle to find her in the garden, kneeling in the dirt with her hands bleeding. She'd been pulling up stubborn roots, and the thorns had torn through her palms. Mrs. Hale, he crossed the yard quickly. That's enough. She didn't look up. Almost done. Your hands are bleeding. I've had worse. Ethan crouched beside her, and for the first time since she'd arrived, he deliberately invaded her space. He reached out and gently took her wrist, turning her hand to see the damage. Deep scratches, some still bleeding, dirt ground into the wounds. She went very still, not pulling away but frozen, every muscle tense. Let me clean these, he said quietly. I can do it myself. I know you can. Let me help anyway. Margaret finally looked at him. Up close, he could see the fine lines around her eyes, the small scar near her temple, the wariness that never quite left her expression. They stayed like that for a long moment, her hand in his, neither moving. Why? She asked finally. Why what? Why are you being kind to me? The question hit him harder than it should have. Why wouldn't I be? Because kindness has a price, it always does. Ethan released her hand slowly and sat back on his heels. Not here. Not with me. She studied him, searching his face for the lie, the trick, the hidden cost. When she didn't find it, something in her expression shifted, not softening exactly, but something close to it. I don't understand you, she said. Good. That makes two of us. She almost smiled. Almost. Instead, she stood, brushing dirt from her skirt. I should wash these inside. Use the good soap. Top shelf in the kitchen. She nodded and walked toward the house, moving carefully, like someone who'd learned to navigate around pain. Ethan stayed in the garden, looking at the work she'd done. The plot was twice the size it had been that morning, neat rows already forming, the soil dark and ready. She wasn't just working, she was transforming. The question was why? That night, for the first time, she joined him for supper. Ethan had gotten into the habit of eating alone, but when he sat down, she appeared in the doorway with a plate of her own. She didn't ask. She just sat at the opposite end of the table and began to eat, her bandaged hands moving carefully. They ate in silence for a while. Then, without looking up, she spoke. The land you bought, in Missouri. That was my husband's property. Ethan set down his fork. I didn't know that. No reason you would. It was sold after he died. I wasn't consulted. She cut a piece of meat with slow precision. His family handled everything, said I had no claim, said the debts were too large. What debts? Gambling, drinking, bad investments. Jonathan was good at making promises and bad at keeping them. She said it without emotion, like reciting facts. When he died, I thought I'd finally be free of it. Turns out debt follows you even after death. You're not responsible for his debts. I was his wife. In Missouri, that's responsibility enough. Ethan watched her eat, the careful way she moved, the controlled expressions. How did he die? Margaret's hand stilled. For a long moment, she didn't answer. When she did, her voice was very quiet. They said it was an accident. He fell down the stairs, hit his head, died before morning. And you? I was there. I heard him fall. I went to him, but... She paused, fingers tightening on the fork. It was too late. You tried to help him. I did. She looked at him then, and her eyes were full of something dark and complicated. But not everyone believed that. Understanding came slowly, then all at once. The way the family had rushed her out of Missouri. The mark instead of a signature. The indenture contract disguised as charity. They think you killed him, Ethan said. Margaret didn't deny it. She just held his gaze, unflinching. They think a lot of things. What they can prove is different. Did you? The question should have been offensive, should have made her angry. Instead, she smiled, a thin, bitter smile that didn't reach her eyes. If I had, Mr. Cole, I'd be in jail, not here. She pushed her plate away, the food only half eaten. But suspicion is a powerful thing, powerful enough to make a woman disappear without a trial. So they sent you here. They sent me somewhere I couldn't embarrass them, somewhere far enough away that no one would ask questions. She stood, gathering her plate. And somewhere, I suspect, they thought the wilderness might take care of the problem permanently. Ethan stood too. You're not a problem. You don't know that. I know enough. Margaret carried her plate to the kitchen, and he followed. At the sink, she turned to face him, and there was something fierce in her expression now, something that had been buried under all that careful control. You know nothing about me, she said. You don't know what I've done or what I'm capable of. You don't know if I killed my husband or if I let him die when I could have saved him. You don't know what kind of woman stands by and watches a man bleed without calling for help. Then tell me. Why? So you can judge me, decide if I'm worth the bread I bake or the garden I tend? So I can understand. Ethan moved closer, not crowding her, but not backing away either. You're right. I don't know you, but I know what I see. Someone who works until her hands bleed. Someone who's been taught to expect nothing and give everything. Someone who's afraid that kindness is a trick. It usually is. Not here. You keep saying that, Margaret said, her voice rising slightly. Not here. Not with you. Like this place is different. Like you're different. But men are all the same, Mr. Cole. They take what they want and call it fair. They hurt what they own and call it love. She stopped abruptly, as if surprised by her own words. The anger drained out of her, leaving something raw and tired in its place. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "That was inappropriate." It was honest. Honesty isn't always appropriate. Ethan reached past her and picked up a dish towel. "I'll wash, you dry." She stared at him. "What?" "The dishes. I'll wash, you dry, unless you've got somewhere else to be." Margaret looked at the towel he was offering, then at his face, searching again for the trick. When she took the towel, her fingers brushed his for just a moment. They worked in silence, the lamplight casting long shadows across the kitchen. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows. Summer storms were coming. Ethan could feel it in the air, the pressure building. When the last dish was dried, Margaret folded the towel carefully and set it on the counter. "I didn't kill him," she said without looking up. "But I didn't save him either, and I've never been sure which is worse." Before he could respond, she walked away, her footsteps echoing down the hallway. Her door closed, and the house fell silent again. But something had changed. The silence felt different now, not empty, but full. Full of words unsaid, questions unasked, truths waiting to surface. Ethan blew out the lamp and stood in the darkness, thinking about the woman in the back room who'd been sent here to disappear. She wasn't disappearing. If anything, she was becoming more visible every day, despite her best efforts to stay invisible. And that, Ethan suspected, was going to be a problem. Not for him. For whoever had sent her here expecting her to vanish without a trace. The storms came 2 days later, rolling across the prairie like dark bruises spreading over skin. Margaret watched them from the kitchen window, her hands working dough that she didn't need to make but couldn't stop herself from starting. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and she felt it in her chest, that old familiar tightening that had nothing to do with weather. She'd been at the ranch for 3 weeks now, and the patterns had settled into something almost comfortable. Rise before dawn, work until dark, speak only when necessary. Ethan let her be, which was its own kind of gift. He didn't hover, didn't demand, didn't expect gratitude for basic decency. It unsettled her more than cruelty would have. The dough was ready. She shaped it into loaves with practiced hands, each motion precise. Baking was the one thing that had always been hers. Even in Missouri, even in that house where nothing belonged to her, the kitchen had been her domain. Jonathan had liked fresh bread, had demanded it, actually, along with everything else he'd demanded. She pushed the thought away and focused on the rhythm of her hands, the familiar comfort of flour and yeast and salt. The door opened behind her. She didn't turn, but she heard Ethan's boots, the way he paused in the doorway. "More bread?" he asked. "The last loaves are gone." "We ate one. I saw you throw the other 2 to the chickens." Margaret's hands stilled. She hadn't thought he'd noticed. "They were burned." "They weren't." She turned then, wiping her hands on her apron. He was watching her with that steady gaze that saw too much, always saw too much. His shirt was damp with sweat from working in the heat, his hair curling slightly at the edges. "If you have something to say, Mr. Cole, say it. You don't have to prove anything." "I'm not trying to prove anything. I'm baking bread." "You're baking bread you'll throw away because it's not perfect." He moved into the kitchen, pulling a cup from the shelf. "You work until you're exhausted. You eat half of what you cook, and you act like taking up space is a crime." Margaret felt heat rise in her chest, anger, or something close to it. "What exactly would you have me do? Sit idle? Take your charity and give nothing back?" "I'd have you stop treating yourself like a debt that needs paying." The words hit harder than they should have. She turned back to the dough, shaping it more forcefully than necessary. "You don't understand." "Then help me understand." "There's nothing to understand. This is what I know how to do. Work, contribute. Make myself useful so no one has a reason to—" She stopped, biting back the rest. "Reason to what?" Margaret pressed her palms flat against the counter, staring down at the flour-dusted surface. Outside, lightning flickered and thunder followed seconds later. The storm was getting closer. "To send me away," she finished quietly. Ethan set down his cup. She heard him move closer, felt him standing just behind her left shoulder. Not touching, but close enough that she could feel the warmth of him. I'm not sending you away, Margaret. The use of her first name made something crack in her chest. She'd been Mrs. Hale for so long, first Jonathan's wife, then Jonathan's widow, always defined by a man who'd never seen her as anything but property. Hearing her own name in Ethan's voice, rough and honest, made her feel dangerously close to something she couldn't afford. You don't know what you're promising, she said. I know exactly what I'm promising. She turned to face him, and the anger she'd been holding back finally surfaced. Do you? Do you know what it means to harbor someone accused of murder? Do you know what happens when the law comes asking questions and finds me here, living on your property, eating your food, sleeping under your roof? You haven't been charged with anything. I don't have to be charged. Suspicion is enough. A woman alone, a dead husband, a family eager to see her gone, that's a story people believe without needing proof. Ethan's jaw tightened. Let them believe what they want. You're here because of a legal contract, nothing more. Anyone asks, I show them the papers. And if they ask why I was really sent here, why a family would pay to get rid of a widow, then I'll tell them it's none of their damn business. Margaret laughed, a sharp, bitter sound. You think it's that simple? You think you can just refuse to answer and they'll leave it alone? I think, Ethan said carefully, that you're not giving me enough credit. I've dealt with people asking questions before. I know how to say no. She studied his face, looking for doubt, for hesitation. Found neither. Why are you doing this? Because it's right. Right, she repeated. Men don't do things because they're right. They do things because they want something. What do you think I want? The question hung between them. Margaret had answers, too many answers, all of them learned through pain. Men wanted submission, gratitude, silence. They wanted to be admired for the barest scraps of kindness. They wanted to own what they claimed to protect. But when she looked at Ethan, she couldn't find any of that in his face. I don't know, she admitted, and that scares me more than anything else. Thunder cracked overhead, close enough to rattle the windows. The first drops of rain hit the roof, tentative, then building to a steady drumming. Ethan glanced toward the window. Storm's here. I need to check the barn, make sure everything's secured. He was giving her an escape, she realized. A chance to end this conversation before it went further. She should take it, should retreat to her room and rebuild the walls she'd let slip. Instead, she heard herself say, I'll help. Ethan looked at her in surprise. You don't have to. I know. She untied her apron and hung it on the hook by the door. But I'm not afraid of storms. That was a lie. She was terrified of storms, but she was more terrified of staying in the house alone, of letting the silence and the thunder pull her back to another stormy night, another set of stairs, another man's blood on her hands. They ran through the rain to the barn, water soaking through her dress in seconds. Inside, the air smelled of hay and leather and animals. The horses stamped nervously in their stalls, and Ethan moved between them with calm efficiency, checking latches, soothing with low words. Margaret grabbed a lantern and climbed the ladder to the loft, checking the shutters on the high windows. One was loose, banging in the wind. She wedged it shut, then paused, looking out at the storm. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the prairie in stark white flashes. Rain came in sheets, violent and cleansing. She'd loved storms once, before Missouri, before Jonathan. Shutters secure? She looked down to find Ethan at the base of the ladder, looking up. It's fixed. Good. Come down before... Thunder exploded directly overhead, and the whole barn shook. One of the horses screamed. Margaret lost her grip on the ladder, and for a sickening moment she was falling, the hay-strewn floor rushing up to meet her. Then Ethan's arms were around her, breaking her fall, his body cushioning hers as they hit the ground together. They landed hard, his back taking the impact, her weight driving the breath from his lungs. For a moment, neither moved. Margaret was pressed against his chest, could feel his heart hammering beneath her palm, could smell rain and sweat and something uniquely him. His arms were still around her, holding her close, and she realized with a shock that she felt safe. She hadn't felt safe in years. You hurt? Ethan's voice rumbled beneath her ear. No, You? Been worse. She should move, should pull away, reestablish distance. But she stayed where she was, listening to his breathing slow, feeling the solid warmth of him beneath her. Margaret. His voice was careful. I'm going to let go now, unless you need... I'm fine. She pushed herself up quickly, her face burning. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to... Nothing to be sorry for. He sat up, wincing slightly. You fell. I caught you, that's all. But it wasn't all, and they both knew it. Something had shifted in that moment of contact. Some barrier had thinned. Margaret could feel it between them, dangerous and tempting. She stood, brushing hay from her dress. The horses need tending. Right. They worked side by side in silence, but it was different from the careful silence of before. This silence hummed with awareness. With words neither was ready to speak. When they finished, the storm had settled into steady rain. We should get back to the house, Ethan said. Margaret nodded, but as they reached the barn door, another flash of lightning revealed something that made her freeze. A figure on horseback approaching through the rain, then another, then three more. Ethan saw them too. His hand went to his hip where he usually wore his gun. It wasn't there. He'd left it in the house. Get behind me, he said quietly. Who are they? Don't know, but 5 riders coming to a lone ranch in a storm, that's not a social call. The riders drew closer, materializing out of the rain like ghosts. Margaret felt ice spreading through her veins. She knew those shapes, knew the way the lead rider sat his horse. Oh God, she whispered, it's them. Who? The Hales, Jonathan's family. Her hand found Ethan's arm, gripping tight. They've come for me. The riders pulled up in front of the barn. The lead man was tall and broad, with Jonathan's same weak chin hidden under a dark beard. His name was Samuel, Jonathan's older brother, the one who'd taken control of the estate, the one who'd looked at Margaret with naked hatred at the funeral. Margaret Hale, he called out, his voice cutting through the rain. We know you're in there. Come out peacefully, and there won't be trouble. Ethan stepped forward, putting himself between Margaret and the riders. This is private property. State your business. Samuel's eyes narrowed. You Cole? I am. Then you're harboring a fugitive. We're here to take her back to Missouri to answer for what she's done. She's done nothing. She's here under a legal contract arranged by your family. That contract was made under false pretenses. We didn't know the full extent of her crimes when we made those arrangements. Samuel shifted in his saddle, and Margaret saw the rifle strapped to his side. We've since learned evidence that proves Margaret Hale murdered my brother. That's a lie, Margaret said, stepping forward despite Ethan's attempt to keep her back. You know it's a lie, Samuel. Do I? You were alone with him when he died. You stood to inherit if the will hadn't been changed. You had motive, means, and opportunity. He smiled, and it was cruel. And now we have proof. What proof? A witness. Someone who heard you threaten Jonathan the night before he died. Someone who can testify that you said you'd rather see him dead than spend another day under his roof. Margaret's mind raced. She had said that, had screamed it actually, after Jonathan had come home drunk and violent, after she'd locked herself in the kitchen with a knife to keep him from breaking down the door. But there had been no one there to hear it, unless... Emily, she breathed. The housemaid, young and scared, who'd hidden in the pantry that night, who'd begged Margaret not to tell Jonathan she'd been there when she was supposed to be home with her sick mother. Emily Graves has given a sworn statement, Samuel confirmed. Says you threatened my brother, says you were cold and calm the morning after he died, not grieving like a proper widow should. I mourned him, Margaret said, and her voice shook with rage. I mourned the man I thought I married, the one who didn't exist. But I didn't kill him. A jury will decide that. Now come along, or we'll take you by force. Ethan's voice was steel. You're not taking anyone anywhere. Margaret is under my protection, and she's staying here until this matter is settled properly, through legal channels, not a lynch mob in the rain. You're interfering with justice. I'm preventing a murder, because that's what this is, isn't it? You don't want a trial. You want her silenced before anyone starts asking the right questions. Samuel's hand moved toward his rifle. The other riders shifted, hands going to their weapons. Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs. This was it. The moment she'd been dreading since the day she'd arrived. She could run, could hide, could fight, or she could surrender and hope the law would actually care about the truth. But she'd learned long ago that the law rarely cared about women who didn't know their place. "I'll go with you," she said quietly. "No." Ethan's voice was flat. "I won't let you die for me." "Not your choice to make." "Ethan, no." He looked at her then, and his eyes were fierce. "You told me you didn't kill him. I believe you, and I'm not letting them take you to a trial where the verdict's already decided." "How touching," Samuel said. "The hired hand playing protector. Step aside, Cole, before you get hurt." "I'm not a hired hand. I'm the legal owner of this property, and Margaret is here under contract. You want her, you'll have to go through the territorial courts. File charges properly, present your evidence, and let a judge decide. Until then, she stays here. The law's already on our side. We have the sheriff waiting in town ready to arrest her on sight. Then bring the sheriff here. Let him see the contract, hear both sides. But you're not dragging her off my land in the middle of a storm like a criminal." The writers exchanged glances. Margaret could see the calculation happening. 5 men against 1 unarmed farmer. Easy odds. But something in Ethan's stance, in the unflinching way he met Samuel's gaze, gave them pause. Samuel's horse sidled nervously, sensing the tension. "This isn't over, Cole. That woman is a murderer, and she'll hang for what she did, contract or no contract. If she's a murderer, prove it in court. Otherwise, get off my land." For a long moment, no one moved. Rain streamed down, the storm showing no signs of letting up. Then Samuel wheeled his horse around. "We'll be back with the sheriff, and a warrant. You protect her after that, you'll be charged as an accessory." They rode off into the storm, disappearing as quickly as they'd come. Margaret stood frozen, staring after them, her mind reeling. Ethan touched her shoulder gently. "Come on, let's get inside." She let him guide her back to the house, moving like someone in a dream. Inside, he wrapped a blanket around her shoulders and built up the fire. She sat at the table, shaking, not from cold, but from the aftershock of fear. "They'll be back," she said when she could speak. "With the law this time." "I know." "You should have let them take me." "No." "Ethan, you don't understand what you've done. You've made yourself part of this now. When they come back, I'll handle it." He sat across from her, his hands flat on the table. "Margaret, look at me." She raised her eyes to his. "Tell me what really happened the night Jonathan died." She wanted to look away but couldn't. His gaze held her, steady and patient, waiting. And for the first time since that terrible night, she wanted to tell someone the truth. Not the version she'd told the family, not the careful half-truths she'd given the constable, but the real story. "He was drunk," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "He'd lost money gambling, and he came home angry. I tried to stay out of his way, but he—" She paused, gathering courage. "He liked to hurt me when he was angry, said it cleared his head." Ethan's hands clenched into fists, but he said nothing. "That night was worse than usual. He chased me through the house, and I ran upstairs thinking I could lock myself in the bedroom, but he caught me at the top of the stairs. He grabbed my arm, and I—" She stopped, the memory so vivid she could smell the whiskey on his breath, feel his fingers digging into her flesh. "What did you do?" Ethan asked gently. "I pulled away. Just pulled away. Trying to get free." And he lost his balance. He went backward down the stairs, hit his head on the landing. I heard the crack from where I was standing. And then? I went down to him. He was still breathing, but there was so much blood. I tried to wake him, tried to stop the bleeding, but he wouldn't respond. I called for help, sent Emily for the doctor, but by the time he arrived, it was too late. Margaret nodded. The doctor said it was the fall that killed him. Massive head trauma. Nothing could have been done even if he'd been there immediately. She looked down at her hands. But the family didn't believe that. They said if I truly wanted to save him, I would have been more upset, would have cried more, grieved more, said my calm was proof I'd wanted him dead. Had you wanted him dead? The question should have offended her. Instead, it felt like a relief to be asked directly. "Yes," she said. "I'd prayed for it more times than I can count. But I didn't kill him, Ethan. I didn't push him. I I just stopped trying to hold on when he tried to hurt me again. That's not murder, Ethan said firmly. That's self-defense. The law doesn't always see it that way, not when a woman defends herself against her husband. Then the law's wrong. She almost smiled at the certainty in his voice, the absolute conviction. It doesn't matter if the law's wrong. It's still the law. It matters, Ethan said, and we're going to prove it. How? Emily's testimony is coerced. Has to be. Why else would she wait months to come forward? He stood, pacing. The Hales are desperate. They're afraid of something, and they're using you to hide it. Afraid of what? That's what we need to find out. He stopped, looking at her. The land they sold me. Jonathan's land. Why sell it at all? If the estate was so valuable, why not keep it? Margaret frowned, thinking. I don't know. Samuel took control of everything after Jonathan died. Said there were debts to pay, arrangements to make. But he kept the main property? The house and the immediate grounds, yes. Everything else was sold or parceled out. To pay debts, Ethan said slowly, or to hide evidence. What evidence? I don't know yet, but think about it. They send you away, discredit you, make sure no one will believe anything you say. Then they produce a witness with a convenient story months after the fact. That's not justice. That's a cover-up. Hope flickered in Margaret's chest, small and fragile. You really believe me? I believe you, Ethan said. And more than that, I believe in you. You're not a murderer, Margaret. You're a survivor. And we're going to make sure everyone else knows that too. Thunder rolled overhead, but softer now, the storm beginning to move on. Margaret pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders and looked at the man standing in front of her, this stranger who'd become her defender, who believed her when her own family wouldn't. Why? She asked again. This time, Ethan didn't deflect. He came back to the table, sat down, and met her eyes with something raw and honest in his expression. Because I know what it's like to be judged for something you didn't do, he said. I know what it's like to have people decide who you are without knowing your story. And I know what it's like to wish someone had stood up for you when it mattered. What happened to you? He shook his head. That's a story for another time. Right now we need to focus on keeping you safe and finding the truth. Margaret wanted to press, wanted to know what shadows lived behind his eyes, but she understood the need to keep some things locked away. She'd been doing it herself for so long. When they come back with the sheriff, she said, what will we do? We'll show him the contract, we'll tell him the truth, and we'll make him see that this is a family trying to silence an inconvenient witness, not justice seeking a criminal. And if he doesn't believe us? Ethan reached across the table and took her hand. His palm was rough and warm, steady as stone. Then we fight, he said, together. Margaret looked down at their joined hands, at the way her fingers fit against his, and felt something unfamiliar stirring in her chest. Not love. She wasn't fool enough to call it that. But trust, maybe. The beginning of it, anyway. Outside, the rain began to ease, and the thunder grew distant. The storm was passing. But both of them knew it was only the first storm. The real one was still coming. They didn't sleep that night. Margaret sat at the kitchen table while Ethan paced, both of them waiting for the sound of horses, for the knock that would mean the law had come. But the hours stretched on in silence, broken only by the dying storm and the creak of the house settling. Dawn came gray and heavy, the sky still bruised from the night's violence. Margaret stood at the window, watching water drip from the eaves, her reflection ghostly in the glass. Behind her, Ethan was reading through the contract again, looking for something they'd missed, some clause or provision that might help. There's nothing here, he said finally, frustration edging his voice. It's a standard settlement agreement. Transfer of property, assumption of obligations, term of residence. Nothing that explains why they were so eager to get you out of Missouri. Maybe there is no reason beyond what Samuel said. Maybe they just wanted me gone. No. Ethan set the papers down. People don't go to this much trouble without a reason. The contract alone, getting you here, making it legal, making sure you couldn't leave, that took planning. Money. Why spend all that if they just wanted you disappeared? Margaret turned from the window. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting they need you here specifically, far from Missouri, far from anyone who knew Jonathan, far from... He stopped, his eyes widening slightly. Far from the property. What? The land I bought. It wasn't just any parcel. It was the eastern section, the part that bordered the river, prime territory. Ethan stood, moving to the shelf where he kept his papers. The deed transfer came with water rights, mineral rights, everything. Why would they sell that? I told you there were debts, but they kept the main house, the town property, everything visible. They only sold the remote parcels, the ones no one would pay attention to. He pulled out the deed, spreading it on the table. What if there's something on that land they don't want found? Margaret moved closer, studying the document. Like what? I don't know. But if Jonathan was involved in something illegal, something that could ruin the family name or cost them everything, they'd want to bury it. And they'd want to make sure the one person who might know about it was too discredited to ever be believed. You think Jonathan was hiding something on the land? I think it's possible. Ethan looked at her. Did he ever go there? To the eastern property? Margaret thought back, sifting through memories she'd tried to forget. Sometimes. He'd disappear for days, said he was checking on investments, meeting with business partners. I never questioned it. Where did he say he was going? He didn't. Jonathan didn't explain himself to me. She paused, then added quietly, but once I found mud on his boots, red clay, the kind that only comes from river country. And he was angry when I noticed it, told me to mind my own business. Ethan's expression sharpened. When was this? A few months before he died, late winter, I think. And he never told you what he was doing there? No, but he came back with money sometimes, cash, not bank drafts. He'd lock it in his desk and tell me not to touch it. Margaret felt something cold settling in her stomach. You think he was involved in something criminal? I think it's worth investigating. If we can find proof that Jonathan was using that land for illegal purposes, it gives the Hales a motive to discredit you. You're not just an inconvenient widow, you're a potential witness to whatever he was doing. But I don't know anything about it. They don't know that, and they can't risk you figuring it out. Ethan folded the deed carefully. I'm going to ride out there today, see what I can find. Not alone. The words came out sharper than Margaret intended. If you're right, if there is something dangerous out there, you'll need help. It's too risky for you to come. If the sheriff shows up while we're gone, then he'll find an empty house. But I'm not staying here waiting to be arrested while you ride into whatever trouble Jonathan left behind. She met his eyes. You said we fight together. That means I come with you. Ethan studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded. We leave in an hour, dress for riding and bring water. It's a half-day's journey and we'll need to move fast. They prepared in tense silence, gathering supplies, saddling horses. Margaret changed into the split-riding skirt she'd brought from Missouri, one of the few practical items the Hales had allowed her to keep. When she came out of the house, Ethan had 2 horses ready, his gelding and a smaller mare he usually used for light work. She's steady, he said, helping Margaret mount. Stay close and follow my lead. They rode east across the prairie, the land rolling out before them in endless waves of grass still heavy with rain. The sun broke through the clouds in shafts of light that moved across the landscape like searching fingers. Margaret hadn't ridden in months, and her body protested the pace, but she gritted her teeth and kept up. They didn't talk much. The wind carried their words away, and there was a tension in Ethan's shoulders that told her he was watching for trouble. Once, he pulled up suddenly, hand raised in warning. Margaret froze, following his gaze to a line of riders on the horizon. But they were moving south, away from them, and after a moment Ethan urged his horse forward again. Could be ranchers, he said. Or could be Hales men. Either way, we don't want to be seen. They kept to the low ground after that, following creek beds and tree lines. The land changed gradually, the grass giving way to scrub, and then to the red clay Margaret had remembered. The river came into view around midday, a brown snake winding through the territory. Ethan led them to a ridge overlooking a valley. Below, Margaret could see what had once been a small settlement, a few buildings, long abandoned, their roofs caving in. But there were signs of recent activity too. Fresh wheel ruts in the mud, the remains of a fire pit, and something that made her breath catch, A grave. Fresh-turned earth marked with a simple wooden cross. "Stay here," Ethan said, dismounting. "No." Margaret slid from her horse. "Whatever this is, I need to see it." They approached the settlement carefully, eyes scanning for movement. The buildings were empty, stripped of anything useful, but the fire pit was recent, days old at most. Ethan knelt beside it, sifting through the ashes. Someone was here recently. Burned papers, looks like. He held up a charred fragment. Can't make out what it said. Margaret moved to the grave. It was fresh, the earth still dark and loose. The cross was crude, made from 2 pieces of scrap wood tied together with wire. No name, no date. "Ethan," she called softly. He joined her and they stood looking down at the unmarked grave in silence. Then Ethan knelt and began to dig with his hands, scraping away the loose soil. "What are you doing?" Margaret asked, though part of her already knew. "Finding out who's buried here." "You can't just... If this is connected to Jonathan, we need to know." He looked up at her. "You don't have to watch." But she did. She knelt beside him and helped dig, her hands sinking into the cold, wet earth. They didn't have to go deep. 2 feet down, Ethan's fingers hit something solid. He brushed away more soil, revealing fabric, a coat, and beneath it, the unmistakable shape of human remains. Margaret's stomach turned, but she didn't look away. Ethan carefully uncovered more, enough to see that the body was recent, maybe weeks old. A man, judging by the size and clothing. His face was too decomposed to identify, but there was something in his pocket. Ethan reached in carefully and pulled out a leather wallet. Inside, a badge, tarnished silver with an engraving. Deputy Marshal, Missouri Territory. "Oh, God," Margaret whispered. Ethan sat back on his heels, staring at the badge. Jonathan wasn't just hiding something. He killed a lawman. Or someone did. We don't know it was Jonathan. The timing fits. You said he came back with money sometimes, acted secretive. What if he was running something out here? Smuggling, maybe, or counterfeiting, and this marshal got too close? Margaret's mind raced. If Jonathan killed a federal marshal, the Hales would do anything to cover it up. They'd lose everything, the land, the money, their name. And you're the only person who might know about it, the only one who could connect Jonathan to this place, to whatever he was doing here. Ethan stood, still holding the badge. They're not trying to punish you for Jonathan's death. They're trying to silence you before you can expose what he did. But I didn't know. I swear, I had no idea. I believe you, but they can't take that chance. He looked around the settlement, his expression grim. We need to get this to the territorial marshal. Real law, not local sheriffs the Hales might have in their pocket. The nearest marshal's office is in Cheyenne. That's 3 days' ride. Then we need to move fast. Ethan started to rebury the grave, working quickly. Once the Hales realize we know about this, they'll do whatever it takes to stop us. A sound made them both freeze, hoofbeats coming fast from the west. Multiple riders closing in. "Run," Ethan said, grabbing Margaret's hand. They sprinted for the horses, but they were too late. Riders appeared from both sides of the valley. 6 of them, spread out to cut off escape. Samuel Hale rode at the center, and this time he had the sheriff with him. Ethan and Margaret backed against the abandoned building, Ethan putting himself in front of her. His hand went to his gun, but he didn't draw, not yet. "Well now," Samuel called out, reining in his horse. "Looks like we've caught ourselves a couple of grave robbers." The sheriff, a heavy man with a red face and hard eyes, spat tobacco juice into the dirt. "That true, Cole? You been digging up bodies?" "We found a grave," Ethan said carefully, "unmarked and recent. We were investigating." "Investigating what?" "A murder." Ethan pulled out the badge, holding it up. "This man was a deputy marshal. Someone killed him and buried him here, on land that used to belong to Jonathan Hale." Samuel's face went pale, then red with rage. "That's a lie. You planted that badge trying to frame my family." "Why would I do that?" Ethan interrupted. "I didn't know this grave existed until an hour ago, but you did, didn't you, Samuel? That's why you sold this land so fast after Jonathan died. You needed to get rid of the evidence." "Evidence of what?" the sheriff demanded. "Of whatever Jonathan was doing out here. Smuggling, most likely. And when this marshal started asking questions, Jonathan killed him. Ethan's voice was steady, but Margaret could see the tension in his stance. The Hales have been trying to cover it up ever since. That's why they sent Margaret away, not because they think she killed Jonathan, but because they're afraid she knows about this. That's preposterous, Samuel snarled. My brother was a respected businessman. Your brother was a criminal, Margaret said, stepping out from behind Ethan. And you knew it. You all knew it. That's why you were so eager to blame me for his death. Why you couldn't let anyone look too closely at what he was doing or where he was going. The sheriff's eyes narrowed. That's a serious accusation, ma'am. It's the truth. And if you dig in the right places, you'll find proof. Records, maybe? Witnesses. Whatever Jonathan was running, he wasn't doing it alone. Samuel's hand moved toward his gun. You've got no proof of anything except your own guilt. Sheriff, I want them both arrested. Grave robbing, defamation, interfering with— Shut up, Samuel. The sheriff's voice cut through the air like a blade. He dismounted slowly, walked to where Ethan stood, and held out his hand. Let me see that badge. Ethan handed it over. The sheriff examined it carefully, turning it over in his thick fingers. His expression was unreadable. Where's the body? He asked. Ethan pointed to the grave. The sheriff walked over, knelt, brushed away some of the soil they'd hastily replaced. He stayed there for a long time, studying what he could see. Then he stood and turned to Samuel. You know anything about a deputy marshal going missing in these parts about 6 months back? Samuel's jaw worked. I don't keep track of every lawman's movements. His name was Thomas Fletcher, 26 years old, sent from Cheyenne to investigate reports of illegal trade along the river. Never came back. The sheriff's voice was flat. Marshal's office sent inquiries. Your family said you'd never heard of him. We hadn't. There's a badge with his name on it in that grave, Samuel, along with a body that's been in the ground about the right amount of time. The sheriff spat again. You want to tell me how that happened on your family's land? The silence stretched out. Margaret could see Samuel calculating, weighing options. Then his face hardened with decision. I want a lawyer before I say anything else. And I want these two arrested for trespassing and defamation. You'll get your lawyer, the sheriff said. But first, we're going to finish digging up that grave and get Fletcher's body to Cheyenne for proper identification. And then we're going to have a long talk about what your brother was doing out here. You have no authority. I have all the authority I need. This is my jurisdiction, and that's a dead federal officer in the ground. The sheriff turned to his deputies. 2 of you start digging. Careful now. Treat him with respect. The rest of you keep watch. If anyone tries to leave, stop them. The men moved to obey. Samuel sat rigid in his saddle, his face a mask of barely contained fury. Margaret felt Ethan's hand find hers, squeezing once. They'd done it. The truth was coming out. But as she watched Samuel's eyes, cold and calculating, she knew this wasn't over. Men like him didn't give up when they were cornered. They fought back, and they fought dirty. The deputies worked quickly, clearing away the soil, exposing the body fully. One of them whistled low. Sheriff, you better see this. The sheriff moved to the grave and looked down. His expression changed, surprise, then something darker. That's not all that's down there. Ethan and Margaret moved closer. Beneath the body, wrapped in oilcloth, were packages. The sheriff lifted one carefully, unwrapped it. Stacks of currency, neatly bundled. Counterfeit, Margaret realized, seeing the slightly off color, the imperfect printing. Must be thousands of dollars here, the sheriff said quietly. Maybe tens of thousands. That's what Jonathan was doing, Ethan said, running counterfeit money. Fletcher must have gotten close, and Jonathan killed him to protect the operation. And buried him with the evidence, the sheriff finished. He looked at Samuel. Your brother was printing fake money. And when the law came looking, he murdered a federal officer. That about sum it up? Samuel said nothing, but his silence was answer enough. The sheriff stood, brushing dirt from his knees. Mr. Hale, you're under arrest for conspiracy to conceal a federal crime. Your men too, if they knew about this. You can't arrest me. I didn't know what Jonathan was doing. Then you won't mind answering some questions back in town. The sheriff nodded to his deputies. Take him. As they moved to comply, Samuel's eyes locked on Margaret. The hatred there was pure and absolute. This isn't over, he said softly. You've destroyed my family. I'll see you pay for it. Your brother destroyed your family, Margaret said, her voice steady despite the fear churning in her gut. I'm just telling the truth. They took Samuel away, his men following under guard. The sheriff organized the removal of Fletcher's body and the counterfeit money, working with methodical efficiency. As the sun began to sink toward the horizon, he finally turned to Ethan and Margaret. You two did a brave thing today. Foolish, maybe, but brave. We had to know the truth, Ethan said. Well, you found it, and now we've got to see it through. The sheriff pulled off his hat, wiping sweat from his brow. There'll be an investigation. Federal marshals will come. You'll both need to testify about what you found here. And the charges against Margaret? Ethan asked. The accusation of murdering her husband? The sheriff looked at Margaret thoughtfully. I'd say those charges look a lot different now, in light of what we've discovered. A woman married to a counterfeiter and murderer, living in fear. I suspect a lot of things make more sense, including why the Hales were so eager to see her discredited. So she's free? I can't make that call, but I'll send my report to the territorial judge along with a recommendation that all charges be dropped pending the federal investigation. He settled his hat back on his head. In the meantime, Mrs. Hale, I suggest you stay close to home. And Mr. Cole, I suggest you keep your gun loaded. The Hales have money and influence, and desperate men do desperate things. They rode back to the ranch in the gathering dusk, both lost in thought. The day's revelations sat heavy between them, the murdered marshal, the counterfeit money, the proof of Jonathan's crimes. Margaret should have felt relieved, vindicated. Instead, she felt hollowed out, as if the truth had carved something essential from her chest. You're quiet, Ethan said as they approached the house. I'm thinking about Emily, the housemaid who gave the statement against me. Margaret slowed her horse. They must have paid her or threatened her. She was kind to me in her way. She wouldn't have lied unless she had no choice. We can find her, get her to recant. Maybe. Or maybe she's already run, afraid of what the Hales might do when this all comes out. Margaret dismounted, her legs shaking from the long ride. Either way, it doesn't matter now. The truth is bigger than her testimony. Ethan took the horses to the barn while Margaret went inside. The house felt different now, not safer exactly, but less like a prison. She lit the lamps, started a fire, moved through the familiar motions of making a home habitable. When Ethan came in, she had coffee brewing and bread sliced on the table. They sat across from each other, the silence comfortable now, built on shared danger and mutual trust. What happens next? Margaret asked finally. The marshals investigate. The Hales face justice, or try to buy their way out of it. The judge decides if you're cleared of all charges. Ethan wrapped his hands around his coffee cup. And you decide what you want to do. What do you mean? The contract says you stay here for a year, but circumstances have changed. If you want to leave, go somewhere else. Start fresh where no one knows your name. I'll help you do that. Margaret looked at him in surprise. You'd let me go? It's not about letting you. You're not my prisoner, Margaret. You never were. He met her eyes. I want you to stay, but I want it to be your choice. Not because a piece of paper says you have to. The words settled between them, heavy with meaning. Margaret thought about leaving, about disappearing into some distant territory where the Hales couldn't find her, where Jonathan's shadow wouldn't follow. She could do it, could start over, be whoever she wanted to be. But as she looked around the kitchen, at the bread she'd baked, the garden she'd planted, the careful repairs she'd made to the house, she realized she'd already started over. Here, in this place she'd been sent to disappear, she'd found something she hadn't expected. A home. And maybe, if she was brave enough to admit it, something more. I'll stay, she said quietly. Ethan's expression shifted. Relief, joy, something that made her heart skip. You're sure? I'm sure. Whatever comes next, I'd rather face it here. With you. The last two words came out softer than she'd intended, but she didn't take them back. Ethan reached across the table and took her hand, and this time she didn't pull away. His thumb traced circles on her palm, a gentle unconscious gesture that sent warmth spreading through her chest. Then we face it together, he said. Outside the wind picked up, and Margaret heard the first drops of rain against the windows. Another storm coming, rolling in from the east. But this time she wasn't afraid. This time, she had someone standing with her, and that made all the difference. The rain came hard through the night, but by morning it had softened to a steady drizzle that hung over the land like a veil. Margaret woke to the smell of coffee and found Ethan already up, standing at the window with his rifle propped against the wall beside him. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. "Figured one of us should keep watch." He didn't turn from the window. "Sheriff was right about desperate men." Margaret moved to stand beside him, following his gaze across the gray landscape. Nothing moved except the rain and the grass bending under the weight of water, but the tension in Ethan's shoulders told her he was expecting trouble. "You think they'll come here?" "I think the Hales have spent months building a story about you. Now that story's falling apart, and with it, everything they've worked to protect." He finally looked at her. "Men don't give up power without a fight." She knew he was right. Samuel's face as they'd taken him away had been etched with rage and something darker, calculation. He wasn't the type to accept defeat quietly, especially not with his family's reputation and fortune at stake. "The marshals will come soon," she said, trying to convince herself as much as him. "Once they do, the Hales won't be able to—" "Marshals move slow. It'll be days, maybe a week before they get here from Cheyenne. That's a lot of time for the Hales to try to clean up loose ends." Margaret's stomach tightened. "You mean me?" "I mean both of us. We're witnesses now, the only ones who can testify about what we found at that settlement." Ethan moved away from the window and picked up his rifle, checking it with practiced hands. "We need to be ready." They spent the morning preparing. Ethan secured the barn, moved the horses to stalls where they couldn't be easily spooked or stolen. Margaret gathered supplies, food, water, medical supplies, and packed them in bags they could grab quickly if they needed to run. Neither spoke much, but they worked in careful coordination, each anticipating the other's needs. By midday, the rain had stopped, leaving the world wet and gleaming. Margaret was in the kitchen when she heard it. The distant sound of wagons and horses, multiple riders approaching from the south. "Ethan," she called, her voice tight. He was there in seconds, rifle in hand, moving to the front window. Margaret joined him, and together they watched as a line of wagons and riders emerged from the gray mist. Not the Hales this time, but something that made her heart sink even faster. Townspeople, dozens of them, from the look of it, armed with rifles in righteous anger. "A mob," Ethan said quietly. "They're bringing a mob." The wagons rolled to a stop in front of the house. Margaret recognized some of the faces: merchants from town, ranchers from neighboring properties, people she'd seen on her rare trips into the settlement. At the front of the group was a man in a dark suit, his voice carrying clear and strong across the yard. "Ethan Cole, we know you're in there. Send out the murderess, and there won't be trouble." "Stay back from the windows," Ethan said, but Margaret was already moving toward the door. "What are you doing?" "They're here because of me. I won't let you fight them alone." "Margaret, this is my fight, Ethan." She met his eyes. "It always has been." Before he could argue, she opened the door and stepped onto the porch. The crowd murmured at her appearance, a ripple of reaction moving through them. The man in the suit, a lawyer, Margaret guessed, from his bearing and dress, stepped forward. "Mrs. Margaret Hale, you stand accused of murder, fraud, and conspiracy against the Hale family. These good people have come to see justice done." "Justice?" Margaret kept her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her. "Or revenge?" "The Hales are a respected family in this territory. They've made serious accusations against you, backed by witness testimony and evidence of your violent nature." "Evidence that's been exposed as lies," Ethan said, stepping onto the porch beside her. "The sheriff knows the truth now. He's seen what we found at the settlement, the murdered marshal, the counterfeit money, proof that Jonathan Hale was a criminal." The lawyer's expression didn't change. "So you claim, but the sheriff isn't here, is he? And convenient stories about dead lawmen don't erase the fact that a woman's husband died under suspicious circumstances while she was the only witness." "Jonathan Hale died because he was drunk and violent," Margaret said, her voice ringing across the yard. "He fell down the stairs trying to hurt me. I didn't push him, didn't kill him. I just stopped trying to save myself from him." A convenient tale from a woman with everything to gain from his death. "I gained nothing. His family took everything. The house, the land, even my name. They sent me here to disappear because I was an inconvenience to them, because I knew things about Jonathan they didn't want exposed. What things? Someone called from the crowd. That he was violent, that he drank and gambled away money that wasn't his, that he made trips to remote property where he was running an illegal operation. Margaret felt something breaking open inside her, months of silence and fear finally finding voice. And when a federal marshal started asking questions, Jonathan Hale murdered him and buried him on land he was using to print counterfeit money. The crowd stirred, murmurs growing louder. The lawyer raised his hand for silence. These are serious accusations. Do you have proof? We found the body, Ethan said. Deputy Marshal Thomas Fletcher, buried at the old settlement on the eastern property. The sheriff was there, saw it himself. He arrested Samuel Hale yesterday. Samuel Hale has been released, the lawyer said smoothly. The charges were deemed insufficient, and he's filed a formal complaint against both of you for defamation and interference with family business. Margaret felt the ground shift beneath her. Released? How? The Hale family has resources, Mrs. Hale. Legal representation, influential friends, and most importantly, credibility. You have none of those things. The lawyer's smile was thin and cold, which is why these good people have come today, to ensure that a dangerous woman doesn't continue to spread lies and cause harm to decent folks. This isn't about justice, Ethan said. This is about the Hales using fear and money to silence the truth. The truth, the lawyer said, is that Margaret Hale is a murderer who should have hanged months ago. And if the law won't see it done, then the people will. The crowd pressed closer, and Margaret saw the faces of people who'd made up their minds, who believed the story they'd been told because it was easier than questioning the powerful family that employed them, bought from them, controlled their livelihoods. You don't want to do this, Ethan said, his hand moving to his rifle. The federal marshals are coming. When they do, the truth will come out, and anyone who took part in this will answer for it. The marshals won't come for days, the lawyer said, and by then, justice will already be served. Last chance, Cole. Hand her over, and you can walk away from this. No. Ethan's voice was flat, absolute. She's under my protection, and she stays that way. The lawyer sighed as if disappointed. Then you're both guilty. Take them. The crowd surged forward. Ethan raised his rifle, and the front line hesitated, but there were too many of them, and they knew it. Margaret saw men circling around the sides of the house, cutting off escape routes. Inside, Ethan said. Now. They backed through the door, and Ethan slammed it shut, throwing the bolt. The sound of fists pounding on wood followed immediately, along with shouts and threats. The back door, Margaret said. Already barred. Windows too. Ethan moved to the front window, rifle ready. We can hold them off for a while, but... Glass shattered in the kitchen. Someone had thrown a rock through the window. Then another window broke, and another. The crowd was surrounding the house, testing for weak points. We need to get to the barn, Ethan said. Horses are there. If we can reach them... We'll never make it across the yard. There are too many of them. You have a better idea? Margaret looked around the room, her mind racing. The house was solid, built to withstand prairie weather, but not designed to be defended against dozens of determined people. They had limited ammunition, limited supplies, and no help coming. Unless... The root cellar, she said suddenly. Under the kitchen. Does it have an outside entrance? Ethan's eyes widened. There's a storm door that opens into the garden. I haven't used it in years, but it might give us a way out. They're not watching. They moved to the kitchen, pushing aside the table to reveal the trapdoor in the floor. Ethan pulled it open and cool, damp air wafted up from below. A ladder led down into darkness. I'll go first, Ethan said. Make sure the storm door isn't blocked. He descended quickly, and Margaret heard him moving in the darkness below. Outside, the pounding on the front door was getting louder, more insistent. Someone shouted about bringing an axe from the barn. It's clear, Ethan called up. Come on! Margaret started down the ladder, but movement at the kitchen window made her freeze. A man was climbing through, cursing as he cut himself on broken glass. Their eyes met, and his face twisted with triumph. She's here! In the kitchen! Margaret dropped the rest of the way into the cellar, landing hard. Ethan caught her arm, steadying her. They're coming, she gasped. Above them, boots thundered across the floor. Ethan pushed open the storm door, and gray daylight flooded in. They scrambled up the short flight of steps into the garden, mud sucking at their feet. The garden was on the side of the house, partially hidden from the main yard by the building itself. They could hear the crowd concentrated at the front, but it wouldn't be long before someone thought to circle around. "The barn," Ethan said, pointing. "Stay low and move fast." They ran, bent almost double, using the garden fence and then a line of bushes for cover. Margaret's skirt caught on thorns, and she yanked it free without slowing. Behind them, shouts indicated they'd been spotted. "There! They're running for the barn!" The barn door was open. They dove inside, and Ethan immediately began saddling his gelding with quick, efficient movements. Margaret grabbed a saddle for the mare, her hands shaking but functioning. "We ride north," Ethan said. "There's a line of hills about 5 miles out. If we can reach them, we can lose the crowd in the rocks." "And then what?" "Then we ride for Cheyenne, find the marshals ourselves." The barn doors suddenly swung wide, and 3 men entered, rifles raised. Margaret recognized one of them, a ranch hand who'd worked for a neighboring property, young and scared-looking despite his weapon. "Don't make this harder than it has to be," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "Just come quiet, and nobody gets hurt." Ethan finished cinching his saddle and turned slowly, his own rifle held loose but ready. "You really want to do this, Tommy? Really want to be part of a lynching?" The young man's face flushed. "She's a murderer. The Hales said, the Hales are lying to you. They're using you to cover up their own crimes." Ethan's voice was calm but firm. "Think about it. Why would they need a mob if the law was really on their side? Why not just let the sheriff handle it?" "Because the sheriff's been fooled by her lies, same as you," one of the other men said. He was older, harder, his eyes cold. "Now, put down the rifle and step away from the horses." "Can't do that." "Then we'll have to take them from you." The 3 men raised their rifles, fingers tightening on triggers. Margaret's breath caught. This was it. The moment where everything ended, where the lies won because they were backed by numbers and fear. Then a voice cut through the tension, sharp and commanding. "Lower your weapons, all of you." Everyone turned. Standing in the barn doorway was the sheriff, his own rifle raised and pointed at the 3 men. Behind him were 2 deputies, equally armed. "Sheriff," the older man said, "we're just doing what's right. What's right is following the law, not forming a mob." The sheriff stepped further into the barn, his gaze sweeping over the scene. "I told you people to go home. Instead, you're here threatening citizens under my protection." "The Hales said you'd arrested Samuel by mistake," Tommy said. "Said the charges were dropped." "Samuel Hale is in jail, where he's staying until the federal marshals arrive. The charges weren't dropped. They were expanded." The sheriff's expression was grim. "I've got 3 more Hale men in custody as of this morning, and I'm expecting more arrests before this is done." The lawyer pushed through the crowd gathering at the barn entrance. "Sheriff, you're overstepping your authority. The Hales have rights. So does Mrs. Hale. And right now her rights are being violated by a mob you helped organize." The sheriff turned his hard gaze on the lawyer. "I could arrest you too, counselor. Inciting violence? Interfering with an investigation? Want to test me?" The lawyer's mouth thinned, but he didn't respond. The sheriff looked at the 3 armed men. "Put the rifles down, now." Slowly, reluctantly, they complied. The sheriff nodded to his deputies, who moved forward to collect the weapons. "Everyone who came here today, listen close," the sheriff called out, his voice carrying to the crowd. "This matter is under federal investigation. Anyone who interferes from this point forward will be charged with obstruction of justice. That means jail time, fines, and a permanent record. The Hales don't own this territory, and they don't control the law. Is that understood?" Murmurs rippled through the crowd. People looked at each other, uncertainty replacing the earlier certainty. The power of the mob was breaking, confronted with actual authority and the threat of real consequences. "Go home," the sheriff said. "All of you. This is over." They went slowly, reluctantly, but they went. The wagons turned around, the riders dispersed. Within 20 minutes, the yard was empty except for the sheriff, his deputies, Ethan, and Margaret. The sheriff lowered his rifle and let out a long breath. "That was closer than I'd like." How did you know to come? Ethan asked. Got word from a friend in town that the Hales were stirring people up, spreading stories about a dangerous murderess on the loose. Figured they'd try something like this. He looked at Margaret. You all right, ma'am? Margaret found she couldn't speak. The fear, the anger, the desperate flight, it all crashed over her at once, and she had to lean against the barn wall to keep her knees from buckling. Ethan was there immediately, his hand steadying her. She's all right. Just needs a moment. The sheriff nodded. Understandable. This has been a hell of an ordeal. He paused, then added, I sent a rider to Cheyenne last night. The marshals should be here in 2 days, 3 at most. Until then, I'm posting a deputy here. Anyone comes near this property, they'll answer to me. Thank you, Margaret managed. I don't know how to... No thanks needed. It's my job. The sheriff's expression softened slightly. But I'll tell you this. I've been sheriff in this territory for 15 years, and I've learned to read people. The Hales are guilty as sin, and you're not. Sometimes it's that simple. What happens now? Ethan asked. Now we wait for the federal boys. They'll want to hear your testimony, examine the evidence at the settlement. There'll be a formal investigation, probably a trial. The sheriff looked at Margaret. It won't be easy. The Hales will fight with everything they have, lawyers, money, influence. But the truth's on your side. That counts for something. Does it? Margaret heard the bitterness in her own voice. Truth didn't stop them from sending a mob to kill me. No, the sheriff agreed, but it stopped the mob from succeeding, and it'll stop the Hales in the end. He tipped his hat. I'll have my deputy posted by nightfall. In the meantime, stay close to the house, and stay armed. He left with his men, and Margaret and Ethan stood in the barn, surrounded by the evidence of how close they'd come to disaster. The horses stamped nervously, still saddled, still ready to run. Ethan began unsaddling his gelding with slow, methodical movements. Margaret watched him for a moment, then started doing the same with the mare. They worked in silence, the familiar routine grounding them both. When the horses were settled, Ethan turned to her. You were right earlier. This is your fight. But I need you to understand something. I'm not fighting for you out of obligation or because some contract says I should. I'm fighting because I choose to, because you matter. The words hung in the air between them. Margaret felt something crack open in her chest, something she'd kept locked away for so long she'd almost forgotten it existed. Why? She asked. Why do I matter to you? Ethan moved closer, and when he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. Because you're the bravest person I've ever met. Because you've survived things that would have broken most people, and you're still standing. Because when I look at you, I don't see a victim or a burden. I see someone strong and real and worth fighting for. Margaret's eyes burned with tears she refused to let fall. I'm not brave. I'm just too stubborn to quit. That's what brave is. He reached out and gently tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering against her cheek. You don't have to be fearless. You just have to keep going despite the fear. She leaned into his touch, and for the first time in years, maybe ever, she let herself feel it. The warmth, the safety, the possibility of something more than mere survival. I'm afraid, she whispered. Of what happens next. Of the trial, the questions, the truth coming out. Of what people will think when they know everything. Let them think what they want. The people who matter will see you for who you really are. And who am I? Ethan smiled, and it transformed his face. You're Margaret Hale. You're a survivor, a fighter, and the woman who refused to disappear even when everyone wanted you to. She laughed, a small sound caught between tears and hope. That's a lot to live up to. You've already lived up to it. Everything else is just making sure everyone else knows it too. They stood close in the quiet barn, the world outside still dangerous, but feeling somehow smaller, more manageable. Margaret thought about the mob, the Hales, the trial to come. All of it was still there, still waiting. But standing here with Ethan, his hand warm against her face, she felt something shift inside her. She'd spent so long being afraid, of Jonathan, of his family, of her own capacity for anger and violence. She'd learned to make herself small, invisible, to take up as little space as possible in the hopes that no one would notice her enough to hurt her. But Ethan saw her, really saw her, and instead of being frightened by what he saw, he stood beside her. "When this is over," she said slowly, "when the marshals come and the trial ends and the truth is finally settled, what happens then?" "What do you want to happen?" Margaret looked around the barn, thinking about the house beyond, the garden she'd planted, the bread she'd baked, all the small ways she'd claimed this place without even realizing it. This ranch had been meant as her prison, her exile, but it had become something else entirely. "I want to stay," she said, "not because a contract says I have to, but because this is the first place I've ever felt like I could breathe, like I could be myself without fear." Ethan's hand moved from her face to her hand, his fingers threading through hers. "Then stay. Build a life here. And let me be part of it, if you'll have me." The offer settled between them, full of possibility and risk. Margaret knew the danger wasn't over. The Hales would fight, the trial would be brutal, and there were no guarantees of how any of it would end. But looking at Ethan, feeling the solid warmth of his hand in hers, she made a choice. Not out of desperation or lack of options, but because she wanted to. Because for the first time in her life, she was choosing her own future instead of accepting what others decided for her. "Yes," she said simply. "I'll have you." Ethan pulled her close, and she went willingly, letting herself be held, letting herself feel safe in someone else's arms. Outside, the sun was breaking through the clouds, casting long shadows across the wet earth. The storm had passed. But the real fight, the one that would determine everything, was just beginning. The deputy arrived at sunset, a young man named Carson with nervous hands and a rifle he held like it might bite him. Ethan showed him where to post himself, made sure he had coffee and provisions, then returned to the house where Margaret was trying to restore order to the chaos the mob had left behind. Broken glass littered the kitchen floor. Furniture had been overturned in the brief invasion, and muddy boot prints tracked across the wooden boards. Margaret swept methodically, her movements precise and controlled, but Ethan could see the tremor in her hands. "Leave it," he said gently. "We can clean tomorrow." "I need to do something." She didn't look up from her work. "If I stop moving, I'll start thinking about how close we came to—" Her voice broke and she pressed her lips together, refusing to finish the sentence. Ethan crossed the room and took the broom from her hands. "Then think about what didn't happen. We're alive. We're safe. And in 2 days, the marshals will be here to end this." Margaret sank into a chair, suddenly exhausted. What if the Hales find a way to stop them? What if they pay off the marshals like they did the lawyer and half the town? Federal marshals don't work that way. They answer to Washington, not local money. Ethan sat across from her. And even if the Hales try, the evidence is too strong. A dead lawman, counterfeit money, your testimony about Jonathan's violence, it all points to the same truth. Truth didn't save that deputy marshal. It won't necessarily save us either. "No," Ethan admitted, "but running won't save us for certain. At least here, we're fighting back." She looked at him, and something in her expression made his chest ache. Fear, yes, but also a fragile hope that hadn't been there before. "Why are you so sure we can win?" "Because I've seen you survive worse than the Hales. Because you're still here, still fighting, despite everything they've done to break you." He reached across the table and took her hand. "And because I won't let them take you. Not without a fight they'll never forget." The words settled between them like a promise. Margaret's fingers tightened around his, and for a long moment they sat in the broken kitchen, holding on to each other and the hope that morning might bring something better than fear. That night, Margaret couldn't sleep. She lay in her bed listening to the sounds of the house, the creak of boards, the whisper of wind, Carson's occasional footsteps as he made his rounds. Every noise made her heart race, her body tensing for danger that might or might not come. Finally, she gave up and rose, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. The house was dark except for the dim glow of the banked fire in the main room. She moved quietly, not wanting to wake Ethan, but when she entered the kitchen, she found him already there, sitting at the table with a cup of coffee. "Couldn't sleep either?" she asked. "Old habits. War taught me to sleep light and wake fast." He gestured to the pot on the stove. "Coffee's still hot." She poured herself a cup and sat across from him. They drank in comfortable silence, the darkness wrapping around them like a blanket. Outside, an owl called, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote answered. "Tell me about the war," Margaret said quietly. You mentioned it before, but you've never said what happened. Ethan was silent for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he set down his cup and began to speak, his voice low and steady. I was 17 when I enlisted. Thought it would be an adventure, a chance to prove myself. Instead, it was 4 years of mud and blood and watching boys die for reasons none of us really understood. He stared into his coffee. I did things I'm not proud of, saw things that still wake me up at night. And when it was over, when I finally came home, everyone wanted to know if I was a hero. What did you tell them? Nothing, because there are no heroes in war, just survivors and the dead. And the survivors carry the weight of both. He looked up at her. When I came out here, I wanted to be somewhere no one knew my name or what I'd done. Somewhere I could just exist without the weight of other people's expectations. Margaret understood that desire more than she could say. Did it work? For a while. I built the ranch, worked the land, kept to myself. It was peaceful. He smiled slightly. And then a wagon showed up with a woman who wouldn't stay invisible no matter how hard she tried. I'm sorry I disrupted your peace. Don't be. Peace is overrated when it's just another word for loneliness. Ethan reached across the table and traced a finger along the back of her hand. You didn't disrupt anything, Margaret. You made it better. She felt heat rise in her cheeks and was grateful for the darkness that hid it. I brought danger to your door, the Hales, the mob, all of it. Would have happened to someone eventually. Men like the Hales don't stop at one victim. If it hadn't been you, it would have been someone else. His finger stilled, his hand covering hers completely. At least this way, you're not facing it alone. Margaret turned her hand over, letting their palms press together. His hand was rough and warm, calloused from work, strong in a way that made her feel safe rather than threatened. It was such a simple thing, this touch, but it meant everything. I never thought I'd trust a man again, she admitted. After Jonathan, after everything his family did, I was certain that kindness was just another form of control. And now? Now I'm learning that maybe I was wrong, that maybe there are men who give without expecting everything in return. She looked at him, really looked at him, seeing the scars on his knuckles, the lines around his eyes, the quiet strength that had never once been turned against her. Thank you for being one of them. Ethan stood and moved around the table, pulling her to her feet. They stood close, and she could feel the warmth of him, smell the coffee and leather, and something uniquely him. His hand settled on her waist, careful and gentle. Margaret, he said quietly, I need you to know something. When this is over, when the marshals come and the trial ends and the Hales are dealt with, I want you to stay. Not because of any contract or obligation, but because I can't imagine this place without you in it. Her breath caught. Ethan, you don't have to answer now. I just needed to say it, needed you to know that whatever happens, you have a home here. With me. If you want it. Margaret looked up at him, this man who'd become her defender, her friend, her anchor in a world that had tried to sweep her away. She thought about the future that awaited her, a trial, difficult questions, the exposure of every painful truth. But beyond that, there was the possibility of something she'd never dared to hope for. A life of her own choosing, a home that was truly hers, and maybe, if she was brave enough to reach for it, love. I want it, she said. I want to stay. Ethan's expression transformed, relief and joy flooding his features. He pulled her closer, and she went willingly, her arms wrapping around him, her head resting against his chest. She could hear his heartbeat, strong and steady. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt truly safe. They stood like that for a long time, holding each other in the darkness. Two people who'd been through hell finding comfort in each other's arms. Outside, Carson called out a soft, "All clear," and the night continued its quiet vigil. The marshals arrived 3 days later, riding in with an authority that made even Carson straighten his spine. There were 4 of them, led by a grizzled man named Marshal Tucker, who'd seen 40 years of frontier justice and had the scars to prove it. He listened to their story with a face like carved granite, asking sharp questions, taking detailed notes. Then he and his men rode out to the settlement, returning hours later with grim expressions and the counterfeit money carefully packed in evidence bags. "It's worse than we thought," Tucker said, spreading documents across Ethan's table. Fletcher wasn't the only lawman who went missing investigating this operation. "We've got 2 more deputies unaccounted for in the past year, both assigned to track illegal currency in the Missouri territories." Margaret felt ice slide down her spine. "You think they're all buried out there?" "We're bringing in dogs tomorrow to search the area properly. But yes, ma'am, I think that's likely." Tucker's eyes, hard and knowing, focused on her. Which means the Hales weren't just covering up one murder. They were protecting an entire criminal enterprise. "How extensive was the operation?" Ethan asked. "From what we've found so far, they were printing high-quality counterfeits and distributing them through legitimate businesses across 3 territories. The money was good enough to fool most merchants, which means whoever was running the printing press knew what they were doing." Tucker pulled out another document. "We found receipts at the settlement, orders, shipment schedules, payment records. Jonathan Hale's signature is on most of them." Margaret closed her eyes, trying to reconcile the man she'd known, drunk, violent, careless, with someone capable of running such a sophisticated operation. He wasn't smart enough for that. Jonathan could barely manage the household accounts, which suggests he had partners, smarter partners. Tucker looked at her carefully. "Did he ever mention anyone else being involved? Names, associates, people he met with regularly?" Margaret thought back, sifting through memories she'd tried to bury. His brother Samuel came to the house often. They'd lock themselves in Jonathan's study for hours. And there was a man from back east, someone Jonathan called the Professor. I never met him, but Jonathan said he was helping with investments. Tucker and one of his deputies exchanged glances. "Did this professor have a real name?" "If he did, Jonathan never mentioned it in front of me." "What did he look like?" "I never saw him. Jonathan always met him in town or at the settlement. He said the professor didn't like being seen." Margaret frowned, concentrating. "But once, I found a letter in Jonathan's coat pocket. It was signed with just the initial P and mentioned something about new plates arriving from Philadelphia." Tucker sat forward. "Printing plates?" "I assumed he meant dishes or silverware. But now..." Understanding dawned. "You think this professor was the one actually making the counterfeit money?" "I think it's very likely, and if we can identify him, we can roll up the entire operation." Tucker made a note. "Do you still have that letter?" "No. Jonathan burned everything from his study the week before he died. I remember because the smoke made me cough for days." Margaret paused, then added, "He was agitated that week, barely slept, kept checking the windows like he expected someone to come, and he kept saying he was getting out, that he'd done his part and deserved his share." "Getting out of the counterfeiting operation," Ethan said, "or trying to, which might be why he ended up dead." Tucker tapped his pencil against the table. "Mrs. Hale, I need you to think carefully. The night your husband died, could someone else have been in the house?" Margaret's blood ran cold. "You think someone pushed him down the stairs?" "I think it's a possibility worth considering. A man trying to leave a criminal enterprise, demanding his cut of the profits, that's a man who becomes a liability." "But I was there. I heard him fall. If someone else had been in the house, you said he was chasing you, that you ran upstairs and he followed. Where were you when he fell?" "At the top of the stairs. He grabbed my arm and I pulled away. He lost his balance and went backward." Margaret's hands trembled as she remembered. "There was no one else, just me and Jonathan." "And the housemaid, Emily Graves, who gave testimony against you. Where was she?" "Hiding in the pantry. She'd come to the house that night to borrow money. Her mother was sick and needed medicine. Jonathan didn't know she was there." Tucker made another note. "Or she was told to be there, told to hide and wait, and then provide exactly the testimony the Hales needed to frame you for murder." The implications hit Margaret like a physical blow. "They planned it. The whole thing. They killed Jonathan and made sure I'd take the blame." "It's a theory that fits the facts," Tucker said carefully. "But we'll need more than theory to prove it. We need Emily Graves's real testimony, evidence of who else was in that house, and preferably a connection between the professor and the Hale family." "Samuel will never talk," Margaret said. "He'd rather hang than admit his family was involved in counterfeiting and murder." "Then we'll have to find other ways to make him talk." Tucker stood, gathering his papers. In the meantime, Mrs. Hale, you're under federal protection. No one touches you without going through me and my men. Understood?" Relief washed over her so intensely she felt dizzy. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet. We still have to prove all this in court, and the Hales have deep pockets for lawyers." Tucker's expression softened slightly. "But I've been doing this a long time, ma'am, and I know guilt when I see it. You're not guilty of anything except surviving a bad situation. The rest of this, the counterfeiting, the murders, the cover-up, that's all on the Hales. And I intend to make sure everyone knows it." The trial took place 6 weeks later in Cheyenne, in a courtroom packed with spectators eager to see the downfall of the Hale family. Margaret sat at the prosecutor's table, Ethan beside her, while across the aisle Samuel Hale and 3 of his associates faced charges of counterfeiting, conspiracy to murder, and obstruction of justice. The evidence was overwhelming. The marshals had found 3 more bodies buried at the settlement, the missing deputies Tucker had mentioned, along with a 4th man identified as a printer from Philadelphia who'd likely been the mysterious professor. Records seized from the Hale estate showed years of illegal transactions, forged documents, and payments to officials who'd looked the other way. But the most damning testimony came from Emily Graves, the housemaid who'd accused Margaret of threatening Jonathan. Marshal Tucker had found her working in a saloon 2 territories over, living under a false name and terrified of being discovered. She took the stand trembling, her voice barely audible as she recounted the truth. Samuel Hale had paid her $50 and promised to kill her mother if she didn't testify against Margaret. She'd been in the house the night Jonathan died, hidden in the pantry as instructed, but she'd seen something the Hales hadn't known about. Through a crack in the door, she'd watched a man enter through the back of the house, climb the stairs, and wait in the shadows. When Jonathan chased Margaret to the 2nd floor, when she pulled away from his grip, the man had stepped forward and pushed Jonathan hard in the back, sending him tumbling down the stairs. Then he disappeared the way he'd come, leaving Margaret to take the blame. "Can you identify this man?" the prosecutor asked. Emily's eyes went to Samuel Hale. It was him. Mr. Samuel Hale. He killed his own brother and made it look like Mrs. Margaret did it. The courtroom erupted. The judge called for order, his gavel cracking like thunder. Samuel Hale sat motionless, his face drained of color, while his lawyers scrambled to object, to discredit, to salvage what they could from the wreckage. But it was too late. The truth was out, and it was devastating. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. Samuel Hale and his associates were found guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced Samuel to hang for the murder of Jonathan Hale and the 3 lawmen. His associates received lengthy prison terms. The Hale estate was seized to pay restitution to the families of the victims and to cover the costs of the federal investigation. And Margaret, who'd been sent west to disappear, to be silenced and forgotten, walked out of the courthouse a free woman. Ethan was waiting for her on the steps, and when she emerged into the bright Wyoming sunshine, he pulled her into his arms without a word. She clung to him, feeling the weight of months of fear and uncertainty finally lifting from her shoulders. "It's over," she whispered against his chest. "It's really over." "Not quite," Ethan said. He pulled back slightly, just enough to look at her face. "There's still one more thing we need to settle." Margaret's heart skipped. "What's that?" "The contract says you're indentured for a year. We're only 6 months in." He smiled, and it was full of warmth and mischief. "Question is, do we honor the contract, or do we tear it up and start fresh?" She pretended to consider. "Well, the contract does specify terms of residence and obligation. It would be improper to violate a legal agreement." "Very improper," Ethan agreed solemnly. "On the other hand, the contract was created under false pretenses by a family of criminals. One could argue it's invalid." "One could argue that?" Margaret looked up at him, this man who'd stood by her through everything, who'd believed her when no one else would, who'd offered her not just protection, but partnership. "Or one could argue that contracts don't matter when 2 people choose to be together without any obligation at all." Ethan's smile widened. "I like that argument best." "So do I." She reached up and touched his face, feeling the rough stubble, the warmth of his skin. "Take me home, Ethan." "Home," he repeated, and the words sounded like a promise. They returned to the ranch 3 days later, the journey slower and more peaceful than the desperate rides that had preceded it. The land looked different to Margaret now. not like a prison or even a refuge, but like home. The house welcomed them with familiar creaks and smells, and she moved through it with a sense of belonging she'd never felt before. The garden had survived in their absence, tended by Carson, who'd stayed on as a part-time hand. Margaret walked through it, touching the plants she'd nurtured, feeling the satisfaction of growth and persistence. The bread she'd thrown away had been eaten by birds, and now wildflowers grew where the scraps had fallen. Everything she'd tried to erase or discard had become something new, just like her. Ethan found her there as the sun was setting, the sky painted in shades of gold and purple. He didn't say anything, just stood beside her, both of them watching the light fade over the prairie. "I was thinking," Margaret said finally, "about what comes next." "And?" "The ranch needs work. The south fence is sagging, the barn roof needs patching, and we should expand the garden before winter." She paused. "And I'd like to get chickens. Real ones, not just the half-wild birds that live under the porch." Ethan laughed. "Chickens? That's your grand plan?" "It's a start." She turned to face him. "I spent so long just trying to survive, I forgot how to actually live. I want to build something here, Ethan, something real and lasting." "Then we'll build it," he said simply. "Together." The words settled between them like a benediction. Together. Not alone, not separate, but joined in purpose and hope. Margaret took his hand, threading her fingers through his. "I never thanked you properly. For everything you did, everything you risked. You don't need to thank me." "Yes, I do. You gave me something I thought I'd lost forever. You gave me back myself." "What?" She stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, the solid reality of his presence. "You saw me when I was invisible. You believed me when I was called a liar. You stood with me when everyone else wanted me gone." "Margaret, let me finish." She looked up at him, and what she saw in his eyes made her brave. "I love you. I don't know when it happened or how, but somewhere between the bread and the garden and the storms, I fell in love with you. And I wanted you to know that before we start building our life together. I wanted you to know it's not gratitude or obligation or fear of being alone. It's love." Ethan's hands came up to frame her face, gentle and reverent. "I loved you from the moment you stepped off that wagon and refused to be broken by everything they'd done to you. I loved you when you worked yourself to exhaustion trying to prove your worth. I loved you when you stood in the rain facing down a mob and refused to surrender." He leaned his forehead against hers. "And I'll love you every day of whatever life we build here, for as long as you'll have me." "Always," Margaret whispered. "I'll have you always." He kissed her then, and it was soft and sweet and full of promise. She kissed him back, pouring into it all the hope and joy and fierce determination she'd discovered in herself. This was her choice, her future, her life to live. When they finally pulled apart, the stars were beginning to appear overhead, the same stars that had witnessed every storm and every triumph. Margaret looked up at them, then back at Ethan, and she smiled. "Come on," she said, tugging his hand. "Let's go home." They walked back to the house together. Two people who'd been brought together by lies and circumstances beyond their control, but who'd chosen to stay together out of love and trust and the simple, radical act of believing in each other. Behind them, the garden rustled in the evening breeze, full of growing things that had been planted in exile but had bloomed into beauty. Ahead of them, the house glowed with lamplight, warm and welcoming. And between them, in the space where their hands joined, there was the quiet certainty that what had been meant as punishment had become the greatest gift either of them had ever received. Home. Not the place you were sent, but the place you chose. Not the life you were given, but the life you built with your own hands and heart. Margaret Hale had been delivered to Wyoming as property, as punishment, as a problem to be disposed of. But she'd become something the Hales had never anticipated and couldn't control. She'd become free. And in that freedom, she'd found not just survival, but joy. Not just existence, but love. Not just a place to hide, but a home to cherish. The wagon that had brought her west was long gone, rotted into memory. But the woman who'd stepped down from it, silent and hollow-eyed, had transformed into someone new. Someone who baked bread because she wanted to, who planted gardens because she loved growing things, who stood her ground because she knew her own worth. Someone who'd learned that the greatest revenge against those who tried to bury you is to bloom exactly where you were planted, roots deep and reaching toward the sun. That night, as Margaret lay in bed listening to the familiar sounds of the house settling around her, she thought about the journey that had brought her here. The pain and fear, yes, but also the unexpected grace of finding someone who saw her completely and chose to stand beside her anyway. Tomorrow, they'd start the real work of building a life together. They'd mend fences and patch roofs and plant seeds for next year's harvest. They'd face whatever challenges the territory threw at them, drought or flood, success or failure, joy or sorrow. But they'd face it together, and that made all the difference. Margaret closed her eyes and let sleep take her, knowing that when she woke, it would be to a future of her own making, a future where she belonged not because a contract said so, but because she'd chosen it. And in choosing, she'd found the one thing that had always been denied her. She'd found home.